Hello and welcome to the third video in my series Who Wrote the Quran, and this is also the first video in a subset in which I will be setting out what I call the Jerusalem Thesis. In its later surahs, the Quran refers a great deal to a particular place, which is obviously of great importance to the Quran author and to his audience. This place is primarily known as the Masjid al-Haram, a masjid meaning a place of prostration or a place of worship, haram meaning either forbidden or sacred. And this name appears in the following verses of the Quran. However, the same place is referred to in a variety of other verses and with a variety of other names. In order to demonstrate that these all refer to the same location, requires setting out all these verses in the form of a web or a matrix. So, Surah 5, verse 2, as you see, refers to the Masjid al-Haram. The same verse also refers to the Beit al-Haram, that is the forbidden or the sacred house. And this name appears later in the surah in verse 95 and also in Surah 14, verse 37. Similarly, Surah 8 verse 34 refers to the Masjid al-Haram, and the following verse refers to simply the house. You will see that Surah 22 mentions the Masjid al-Haram in verses 23 and 29. Between these, at verse 26, it refers to my house, and at this point the Quran is talking in the voice of God, so it really means God's house. Verse 29 refers to the ancient house, so a certain house theme in all these other names. In Surah 106 verse 3, one of the titles used for God is the Lord of the house. In 1173, Abraham and his wife are referred to as the people of the house, and this same title, the people of the house, is also used in order to address the Quran's audience in Surah 33 verse 33. We see that 595 refers to the forbidden or the sacred house, but 595 and 597 both use another name to refer to the same place, and that is the Kaaba, often translated as the cube. Surah 2, which we will be looking at in a moment, refers to the house and also my house, again speaking in the divine voice, and so God's house. It also uses yet another name. This time it calls it the Station of Abraham, or the standing place of Abraham. And this name, the station or standing place of Abraham, also appears in Surah 3 verse 97. The previous verse, 396, uses a house title again. It calls it the first house created for mankind at Bakkah. So a rather complex picture. However, what we have is one single location going by all these names: the Masjid al-Haram, the forbidden or the sacred house, God's house, the ancient house, and the first house created for mankind at Bakkah, and also known as the cube, and the standing place or the station of Abraham. In terms of its importance to the Quran audience, this is very great indeed. Believers are instructed to face towards this place whenever they pray. That's in Surah 2, verse 144 and 149, 150. They are also told to make pilgrimage there if they are able to. Surah 2, verse 196. It was a departure point for a mysterious night journey to the furthest mosque in Surah 17:1, and I'll address this in a completely separate video because it's quite a complicated an interesting story. However, of great importance to us is that it was a place from which the Quranic community had been expelled, and which they are ordered to fight to regain access to. This is in Surah 2, verse 191 and 217, also 8:34 and 22:25. God had promised them that they would enter this place in Surah 48, verse 27, and so for the Quranic community, this must fulfill something of the idea of the promised land to the Israelites in the book of Exodus. And it appears as though the Quran community was successful, because in what is generally regarded as the final surah to be composed, that's Surah 9, the Quranic community is said to have made a treaty at this place. That's 9 verse 7. And in Surah 9 verse 28, they are able to finally exclude their opponents from this place. This is a rule that is applied to Mecca in Saudi Arabia to this very day. Therefore, I think it is fair to say that this location, wherever it is, became the focal point for the Quran community's sacred landscape. Given the title of this video, it will come as no surprise that my thesis is that this place, the Masjid al-Haram, is Jerusalem, or to be more precise, it is the Jerusalem Temple, or the land upon which the Jerusalem Temple once stood, the Temple Mount. I first put forward this idea in an interview with Sneakers Corner, which was posted on YouTube on the 11th and the 13th of August 2020. More recently, I've expanded a little in Pafanda Films in interviews with Dr. J. Smith, posted in July and August of 2021. However, I wanted to take the time to set my views out in greater depth here on my own channel than I was able to as a guest of either of those two channels. As we have seen, one of the names used for this place is the Station of Abraham, or the Standing Place of Abraham, and that is the one that I would like to address in the remainder of this video. It's worth taking our time to refresh our memory of some of the story of Abraham as it is told in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 16, Abraham fathers Ishmael by his Egyptian servant Hagar, believing that his wife Sarah is infertile. In chapter 21, however, he then fathers Isaac by his wife Sarah. With her own son, Sarah now demands that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. And Abraham does this, sending them away with only a water carrier and some bread. However, God provides a miraculous spring for Hagar and Ishmael at Beersheba, and he promises to make of Ishmael's descendants a great nation. Ishmael is then said in the book of Genesis to grow up in Paran, which, as you see on the map on the screen, is part of the Arabian Peninsula, the very top of the Arabian Peninsula, but immediately left of the Sinai Peninsula. Ishmael grows up in Paran. He then marries a wife from Egypt, who has been arranged for him by his mother Hagar, who, of course, is herself Egyptian. Genesis chapter 22 tells the famous story of Abraham being asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac, and the sacrifice being aborted at the last moment, with Isaac being replaced by a goat. In chapter 25, we are told that Abraham marries again and has children by his second wife, Keturah. Abraham dies, and although Ishmael hasn't had any contact with Abraham in the book, as far as the book of Genesis tells us, he appears at the funeral, and Isaac and Ishmael bury Abraham together. Ishmael, we are finally told, has 12 sons who become the leaders of 12 tribes, mirroring the 12 sons of Jacob, who father the 12 tribes of Israel, and Ishmael dies at Havilah by Shur on the border with Egypt. Having a look at some of these geographical locations, Beersheba is marked on the map there. It's up in Canaan. Paran, I've said, is to the east of Sinai, and he gets a wife from Egypt. He's able to come back to Canaan in order to bury Abraham, and then he dies himself, we are told, on the border of Egypt. Therefore, the book of Genesis seems to suggest that Ishmael lived his entire life in Paran or near the border with Egypt. There's no indication whatsoever that he went further afield. Now, while we're getting the geography sorted out, let's have a look at Genesis chapter 22 and the testing of Abraham. 22 verse 2 says, "And God said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering, upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." And verse 9 says, "And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, and he laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood." What we are told is that this took place in the land of Moriah, and more particularly, it took place upon a particular mountain that God had pointed out to Abraham. This is described as one of the mountains which I will tell thee of, or in verse 9, the place which God had told him of. In other words, Abraham wasn't told to go to Moriah and pick a mountain of his own. There was one very specific mountain that had been assigned to him. In the second book of Chronicles, verse 3:1, which deals with Solomon building the temple, this is described as being on Mount Moriah, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Now, because of this reference to Mount Moriah and the earlier reference in Genesis to a mountain pointed out to Abraham in the land of Moriah, Jewish tradition has traditionally held that this is one and the same place, and that Solomon built his temple upon the very spot that had been prescribed for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So, demonstrating with a little picture here, a little graphic. There you see Mount Moriah, and you see Abraham preparing to sacrifice Isaac on the summit of Mount Moriah. And David's city was then built afterwards to the south, and then Solomon built his temple with the Holy of Holies over the very spot where Abraham's sacrifice had been due to take place. One of the two references to the station of Abraham in the Quran appears in Surah 2. Surah 2 is, of course, the longest surah of the Quran, and many people find it very difficult to navigate, since it covers a wide variety of topics, and it's not at all clear to the reader coming across it for the first time. However, I've been greatly assisted in making sense of it by this book, the Al-Baqarah Crescendo. Al-Baqarah is the Arabic name for Surah 2. Understanding the Quran Style, Narrative Structure and Running Themes by Nevin Reader. I'm not sure that I would recommend this book for most people embarking on understanding the Quran. It doesn't really refer to the content or substance of Surah 2 in any great detail at all. But where it is excellent is in finding structure within the surah, particularly as it is made clear by certain significant words and phrases which are repeated as strategic points. Nevin Reader demonstrates that Surah 2 consists of three main units that she calls panels. The first of these is verses 1 to 39, and this addresses mankind at large. It describes the creation of Adam by God and also addresses certain aspects that are relevant to the human condition in general. The second panel verses 40 to 123 addresses God's covenant with the Israelites, and more particularly with the Israelites' very many breaches of this covenant. In fact, for 80 verses, the Quran reads as an extended polemic about the faithlessness and disobedience of the children of Israel. The third panel, which comprises more than half the surah, is verses 124 to 286, and Nevin Reader describes this as the emerging Muslim nation. She also divides this into 3 subsections. Verses 124 to 151 address the Abrahamic origins of the new nation. Verses 152 to 242 comprise various ritual and legal prescriptions. And finally, the surah ends on a rather martial tone with 243 to 286, the tests of faith, which concern the kings of Israel having conquered Palestine or Canaan, and also the requirements of jihad for the present generation of Muslims. So we see that the reference to Abraham has not been dropped randomly into a selection of biblical stories and random verses. On the contrary, Abraham's obedience is contrasted with the disobedience of the Israelites set out in the preceding 80 verses, and it is claimed as a foundation narrative and also the source of legitimacy for the new reformed movement that would be following the Quran, and which it would be hoped would be characterized by obedience to God and to God's will as it was made known in the Quran and through the man who announced the Quran. This section begins with verse 124. And when his Lord tried Abraham with certain words, and he fulfilled them, he said, I am making you an imam for mankind. He, presumably Abraham, said, and of my progeny? He, that is God, said, my covenant does not include the wrongdoers. It seems to me that this is a fairly clear reference to the biblical story of the binding of Isaac and the founding of the Abrahamic covenant. It has been argued by some Muslim commentators that this may refer to some other testing of Abraham. For example, when Abraham destroyed his people's idols and he was put on trial by Nimrod. Alternatively, God's instruction to Abraham that he leave his home in Ur of the Chaldees and travel to Canaan. However, I think that when one reads, his Lord tried Abraham, one thinks of the greatest trial that Abraham faced, that is God's commandment that he sacrifice his son. Compared with this, the other testing seems to pale in significance. Also, this test is connected to a covenant that will affect Abraham's progeny. None of the other tests are connected with a covenant, but in the Bible, it is Abraham's obedience to God that makes him worthy of the covenant. Note the reference to my covenant not including the wrongdoers. This is a reference back to the preceding section, which, as I mentioned, is an extended narrative about the infidelity and the disobedience of the children of Israel. The following verse continues. And remember when we made the house a place of visitation for mankind and a sanctuary. Take the station of Abraham as a place of prayer. And we made a covenant with Abraham and Ishmael. Purify my house for those who circumambulate, and those who make retreat, and those who bow and prostrate. Now many people must read this and wonder what on earth it has to connect it with the previous verse 124. One moment you've got a trial of Abraham, and the next moment there's a reference to a house that is a place of pilgrimage and a place of prayer. The connection from the text of the Quran isn't at all obvious unless one is familiar with the book of Genesis, and then the significance becomes clear. The reference to the station of Abraham as God's house, a place of pilgrimage and prayer, makes perfect sense when one knows that the Jerusalem temple, which is referred to throughout the Bible as God's house, was built on the very site that Abraham had been prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. One point of significance which we should note for now, I'll come back and address it in more detail later in the video, is the role of Ishmael. In the book of Genesis, Ishmael had been sent away long before this, and he plays no role in the story of the binding of Isaac. However, in the Quran, he clearly occupies a central position. In verse 125, we are told that the covenant is not simply with Abraham, but is with Abraham and Ishmael. And in verse 127, it is Abraham and Ishmael who raise the foundations of the house, not Abraham alone. I'll come back to this, as I say, a little later in the video. In verse 128, Abraham makes a prayer to God. He asks God, "O Lord, make us submit unto thee, and from our progeny a community submitting unto thee, and show us our right, and relent unto us. Truly thou art the relenting, the merciful." Note the prayer "from our progeny." It's our progeny, not my progeny. And so Abraham in the Quran is praying for a community submitting to God from his and Ishmael's progeny, since Abraham and Ishmael are the two people who are referred to previously, the only people to whom our progeny can relate. In verse 129, he continues his prayer. "O Lord, raise up in their midst a messenger from among them, who will recite thy signs to them, and will teach them the book and wisdom, and purify them. Truly thou art the mighty, the wise." Well, this passage concerning Abraham ends here, but 151, a little bit later, and concluding this subsection, as Nevin Reader has delineated it, verse 151 refers to the Quran's own announcer. And God is speaking, so it's in the divine voice. "Even as we sent among you a messenger from among you, who recites our signs to you, and purifies you, and teaches you the book and wisdom, and teaches you what you knew not." Note that this reference to the Quran announcer, that is, we might as well call him Muhammad for ease of reference, repeats almost word for word the prayer of Abraham, a messenger who will teach and purify and will teach in particular the book and wisdom. So it presents the progeny of Ishmael and the Quran author in particular as being the granting of Abraham's prayer, and absolutely integral to the covenant that God had made with Abraham and Ishmael. You see that the children of Israel are really sidelined in this telling of the story, but there is no doubt that it does relate to the binding of Isaac and the Jerusalem temple. It just gives a particular Quranic twist to the story. The identification of the station of Abraham with the site of the binding of Isaac is also strengthened by the language that the Quran uses. In Surah 2, verse 125, as we have seen, it uses this phrase, the station of Abraham. It's worth reading this little passage again, verse 125, "And remember when we made the house a place of visitation for mankind and a sanctuary, take the station of Abraham as a place of prayer." The station of Abraham, or the standing place of Abraham, literally the place where Abraham stood, renders the Arabic words Maqam Ibrahim. The same phrase is used in Surah 3, verse 97. I'll lead into it with verse 96. "Truly the first house established for mankind was that at Bakar, full of blessing and a guidance for the worlds. Therein are clear signs, the station of Abraham," the Maqam Ibrahim, "and whosoever enters it shall be secure. Pilgrimage to the house is a duty upon mankind before God for those who can find a way. For whosoever disbelieves, truly God is beyond the need of the worlds. Well, the Arabic word makam is obviously very closely connected with the Hebrew word makom. And this word, makom, appears prominently in Genesis chapter 22 in the telling of the binding of Isaac. In verse 3, I'll just read through. Early next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him his son Isaac and 2 of his servants as well, and with the wood that he had cut for the holocaust, set out for the place, Makom, of which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham got sight of the place from afar, again using this word, Makom. The word appears again in verse 9. And when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it, and next he tied up his son Isaac and put him on the wood on the altar. Again this word, makom. And it appears a 4th time in verse 14. Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh. Hence people now say, on the mountain the Lord will see. So it's not simply the ideas and the themes that are similar, it's actually the very language that the Quran uses. When the Quran author wrote Makam Ibrahim, it seems to me absolutely self-evident that he was referring to the Makom of Abraham as it appears in Genesis chapter 22. It can't be a coincidence that a word that is used so prominently in Genesis 22 also appears twice within the Quran. Similarly, in Surah 22, verse 26, and remember when we assigned for Abraham the place of the house, saying, ascribe no partners unto me, and purify my house for those who circumambulate, and those who stand, and those who bow and prostrate. Clearly very similar language to what we have seen already. It doesn't use the phrase Makam Ibrahim, but instead uses this phrase, the place that we assigned for Abraham, the place of the house. The house, the station of Abraham, is a place that has been assigned for Abraham by God. Well, this, it seems to me, is very similar to the phrase, the place of which God had told him, which we find in Surah 3, and again in in verse 3, and again in verse 9 of Genesis chapter 22. So there's a marked similarity of the language being used, as well as the themes being expressed. So to summarise where we have reached at about the midway point in this video, the Quran associates its station of Abraham with a testing of Abraham, a test which Abraham had fulfilled, with a covenant made between Abraham and Ishmael and God in order to benefit their righteous progeny, the raising of the foundations of a structure that is described as a house that was at a place assigned for Abraham by God, and which was God's house, a place of pilgrimage, prayer and circumambulation. We have also seen that the Quran twice uses the word makam, the Hebrew equivalent of which appears 4 times in the binding of Isaac story in Genesis chapter 22 to describe where the binding of Isaac took place. For all these reasons, I conclude that the Quran's station of Abraham fits the biblical description of the site of the binding of Isaac, that is to say Mount Moriah, which would later become the site of Solomon's temple and indeed of Temple Mount in Jerusalem today. In addition, the Quran precedes the account of the covenant in Surah 2 with 80 verses condemning the children of Israel for having breached God's covenant. It states that God's covenant is not with all Abraham's progeny. His covenant does not include the wrongdoers. Therefore, by implication, it no longer includes the children of Israel. It gives Ishmael a prominent role in the story as a party to the covenant and as helping to build the altar upon which his brother was to be sacrificed. And it presents the Quran announcer as a descendant of Ishmael who was the answer to Abraham's prayer at the time of the forming of the covenant. In other words, the Abrahamic covenant is presented as a foundation story of the new righteous nation, raised from Abraham's progeny through Ishmael, not through Isaac, that would replace the faithless children of Israel. Now, as promised, let us have a closer look at the role of Ishmael. In the book of Genesis, as we have seen, Abraham had sent Hagar and Ishmael away before the testing of Abraham, and so Ishmael plays no role at all in the binding of his half-brother Isaac. In the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, a Jewish text, Ishmael is said to have been one of the two servants that accompanied Abraham to the foot of the mountain. Now, the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, in its final form, is post-Quran, but it may well be called a pre-Quran rabbinic tradition. So let us read and see what this Jewish text says. Abraham rose up early in the morning, and he took with him Ishmael and Eliezer and Isaac his son, and he saddled the ass. Upon this ass did Abraham ride. On the third day they reached Zophim, and when they reached Zophim, they saw the glory of the Shekinah resting upon the top of the mountain. As it is said, on the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. What did he see? He saw a pillar of fire standing from the earth to the heavens. Abraham understood that the lad had been accepted for the perfect burnt offering. He said to Ishmael and Eliezer, "Do you see anything upon one of those mountains?" They said to him, "No," and he considered them as an ass, meaning, in this edition, as dull as an ass. He told them, "Since ye do not see anything, abide ye here with the ass." Clearly, the intent here is not to present Ishmael in a positive light, and this forms part of a broader tradition in Jewish writing, in which the decision of Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away was justified by saying things that were, or recording traditions that were negative to their reputations. For example, that Ishmael had endangered Isaac by firing arrows at him. Isaac was 37 years old when he went to Mount Moriah, and Ishmael was 50 years old. Contention arose between Eliezer and Ishmael. Ishmael said to Eliezer, "Now that Abraham will offer Isaac his son for a burnt offering, kindled upon the altar, and I am his firstborn son, I will inherit the possessions of Abraham." Eliezer replied to him, saying, "He has already driven thee out like a woman divorced from her husband, and he has sent thee away to the wilderness. But I am his servant, serving him by day and by night, and I shall be the heir of Abraham." The Holy Spirit answered them, saying to them, "Neither this one nor that one shall inherit." So again, not a particularly flattering description of Ishmael. His father has taken Isaac up to the top of the mountain to sacrifice. Ishmael appreciates this, and his reaction is to look forward to his half-brother's death, and so that he will then become Abraham's heir. So he comes across as a rather selfish, grasping light. Of course, the Holy Spirit answers them in Jewish tradition because saying neither would inherit, since the Holy Spirit knows that God will abort the sacrifice and substitute a goat, and Isaac will be saved. So a Jewish tradition placed Ishmael at the foot of Mount Moriah, albeit not a very flattering tradition. This would then have required only a fairly modest variation by the Quran author to have had Ishmael actually going up the mountain with his father and helping his father to build the altar. And indeed, if Isaac was to be sacrificed on the altar, then Ishmael would indeed be the heir to his father. Moving on, as we have seen in the book of Genesis, there is no explicit account of any interaction between Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael, after Abraham has sent them away from him. However, Ishmael is present at Abraham's burial, suggesting that Abraham and Ishmael have somehow remained in contact with one another. In addition, some rabbinic traditions say that Hagar, and the word Hagar literally means one who sojourns, or the sojourner, is Abraham's second wife, named Keturah, in Genesis chapter 25. Returning to the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, this describes 2 visits by Abraham to Ishmael's home. In both instances, Ishmael is not at home, and Abraham speaks to his wife without getting down from his camel. The first reads as follows. After 3 years, Abraham went to see Ishmael his son, having sworn to Sarah that he would not descend from the camel in the place where Ishmael dwelt. He arrived there at midday and found there the wife of Ishmael. He said to her, "Where is Ishmael?" She said to him, "He has gone with his mother to fetch the fruit of the palms from the wilderness." He said to her, "Give me a little bread and a little water, for my soul is faint after the journey in the desert." She said to him, "I have neither bread nor water." He said to her, "When Ishmael comes home, tell him this story, and say to him, 'A certain old man came from the land of Canaan to see thee, and he said, Exchange the threshold of thy house, for it is not good for thee.'" When Ishmael came home, his wife told him the story. A son of a wise man is like half a wise man. Ishmael understood. His mother sent and took for him a wife from her father's house, and her name was Fatima. Well, the last paragraph is somewhat cryptic. It reads as though some sentences have been taken out, but the gist of it, I think, is fairly clear. Abraham is dissatisfied with Ishmael's wife because of her failure to provide him with refreshment. He passes a coded message to his son, and Ishmael understands this message. Ishmael then must have put his wife aside somehow, divorced her, because the final sentence here is his mother sent and took for him a wife. So he's got himself a new wife, one that he hopes will be more obedient and give a better impression of his hospitality. Her name was Fatima. The fact that his mother sent and took for him a wife accords with what the book of Genesis says, which is that Ishmael marries a wife who has been arranged for him by his mother. The Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer then describes a second visit in almost identical terms to the first. Again, after 3 years, Abraham went to see his son Ishmael, having sworn to Sarah, as on the first occasion, that he would not descend from the camel in the place where Ishmael dwelt. He came there at midday and found there Ishmael's wife. Obviously, it's a different wife to that whom he had encountered on the first occasion. He said to her, "Where is Ishmael?" She replied to him, "He has gone with his mother to feed the camels in the desert." He said to her, "Give me a little bread and water, for my soul is faint after the journey of the desert." She fetched it and gave it to him. Abraham arose and prayed before the Holy One, blessed be he, for his son, and thereupon Ishmael's house was filled with all good things of the various blessings. When Ishmael came home, his wife told him what had happened, and Ishmael knew that his father's love was still extended to him. And the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer ends this little passage with a reference to Hagar being Keturah. It says, "After the death of Sarah, Abraham again took his divorced wife, as it is said, and Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah." Why does it say, "and he again"? Because on the first occasion she was his wife, and he again betook himself to her. Her name was Keturah because she was perfumed with all kinds of scents. So we have this account in this book, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, of Abraham making 2 visits to the house of Ishmael, but not meeting him on either occasion. This will become relevant when we look at the traditional Islamic account of Abraham and Ishmael, which of course is based on the Arabian Peninsula in Mecca. The standard Islamic understanding is that the Quran's references to the Masjid al-Haram, to God's house, the Kaaba, the station of Abraham, and so on, are that these all refer to a shrine at Mecca in the Hijaz. In order for this to fit with the Quran's references to Abraham and Ishmael raising the foundations of the house, this means that Islam has to explain how Abraham and Ishmael came to be on the Arabian Peninsula. The earliest attempt to do this that we know of is in a book called the Musannaf by Abd al-Razak. Abd al-Razak is said to have died in 827, and so what he wrote must have preceded that. So this is the earliest reference that we have. In what is to follow, I shall be relying upon two articles: Hagar's Wanderings Between Judaism and Islam by Marcel Porthuis, and Abraham, Hagar and Ishmael at Mecca, a contribution to the problem of dating Muslim traditions by Harold Motzki. Both these articles are freely available online in PDF form. If you do an internet search for those titles, I'm sure you'll have no difficulty in finding them. In the Musannaf account, this begins with the narrator, who is Sa'id ibn Jubair, addressing his audience. He, that's Sa'id ibn Jubair, said, "Question me, O young men, for I am about to leave from your midst." So the people copiously questioned him. Then one man said to him, "May God grant you good fortune. Have you not seen the Makam?" And you will recall, of course, that the Makam means the station or the standing place. "It is as we were relating." He, Sa'id, said, "What were you relating?" He, the man, said, "We were saying that when Ibrahim, may God bestow well-being upon him, arrived, presumably at the place that later became Mecca, Ishmael, that is, the mother of Ishmael, or Hagar, invited him to dismount, but he refused. Then she brought forth the stone. He, Sa'id ibn Jubair, said, 'It happened not like that.'" So there's the beginning of the story here, and what is particularly important to us is this reference to the stone. A gentleman from the audience thought that it had been brought out for Abraham to rest his feet on, since he was reluctant to dismount from his camel, but Sa'id ibn Jubair said no, the gentleman from the audience was mistaken in his belief. It didn't happen like that. Now the following is a summary of the rest of the story as it is recounted by Harold Motzki in the article that I just mentioned. So these are the words of Mr. Motzki. Ibrahim leaves them there, in Mecca, with only a bag containing some dates and a small water skin. When the water is finished, Ishmael runs up the Al-Safa hill and then up the Al-Marwa hill to look for help, but in vain. She hears a voice and then sees an angel at the place of Zamzam digging a hole in the ground until the water flows. She makes something resembling a basin around it, and she fills her water skin. Some people of the Jurhum tribe come to the place, and Ishmael, Hagar, allows them to settle. Ishmael grows up amongst them, learns Arabic, and marries a woman from amongst them when he reaches puberty. Ishmael then dies. Ibrahim comes to the place to see his family, but finds only Ishmael's wife, since Ishmael is himself off in search of a livelihood. Ibrahim asks Ishmael's wife about their way of life. She complains about it. Ibrahim gives her a message for his son and departs. When Ishmael hears the message, he divorces his wife and marries another woman. Ibrahim comes a second time to the place to see his family, but again finds only Ishmael's wife. Ibrahim asks her about their way of life. This time her answer pleases Ibrahim, and he gives her a message for his son and departs. When Ishmael hears the message, he remains with his wife. On his third visit, Ibrahim finds Ishmael and informs him of God's command to build a house for him at the place. Ishmael helps his father to build the house, bringing to him the stones needed. When the building becomes high, he brings him this stone, and one must assume that Sayyid ibn Jubair, the narrator all those years ago, gestured towards a stone that was in his presence, on which his father, that is Abraham, could stand, in order to place the last rows of stones. After the building is complete, both make the first ritual procession around it. In the book of Genesis, Abraham simply tells Hagar and Ishmael to leave his home, and the two of them set out, equipped only with water and bread. In the Musannaf of Abd al-Razak, however, Abraham escorts Hagar and Ishmael to their new home, to the place of the house, which we must assume refers to Mecca, something like 1,000 miles to the south. Abraham then visits them there, or at least he visits their new home on 3 different occasions, so a rather large amount of travelling for Abraham. Abd al-Razak's account includes several elements from the traditions recorded in the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, in particular Abraham's 2 conversations with Ishmael's 2 wives, the first of whom incurs his displeasure and whom Ishmael later separates from, and the second of whom finds favour with her father-in-law. The account also makes 2 references to a stone. The stone seems to be important. It's never described, except it's referred to once by the Makam as the Makam. However, it seems to be implicit that the audience will be aware of which stone is being referred to. In the first instance, the narrator disputes that Abraham had rested his foot upon the stone during his first visit, the suggestion being put forward by a member of the audience. Instead, he states that Abraham stood upon the stone to build the Kaaba during his third visit. 50 years later, some versions or some elements of this story appear in the collection of hadith, the Sahih al-Bukhari. Sahih al-Bukhari includes 4 different hadith accounts that includes elements of the Musannaf story. These have different isnad chains and include slightly different elements, but they all essentially replicate aspects of the Musannaf account. The one innovation is the detail that Hagar ran between Safa and Marwa 7 times, not just once, in her search for water. 40 years after that, and almost 100 years after the Musannaf of Abd al-Razak, the great Islamic historian al-Tabari records several more traditions in his history and in his commentary on the Quran. These include the explanation for the stone, which one assumes the explanation for the stone that had been rejected in the Musannaf account. There are 2 passages that refer to this. The first states as follows: Abraham asks Sarah for permission to visit Hagar. She consents on the condition that he does not dismount. Ishmael's second wife brings Ibrahim the Makam, a stone upon which he can put his foot, i.e. stand, so that he does not really alight on the ground. A second account gives a slightly more detail. Ishmael's second wife said, "Stay, so I may wash your head." But he would not stay, so she brought him the standing place and put it at his right side. He set his foot on it, and the trace of his foot remained on it. Then she washed the right side of his head. Then she turned the standing place to his left and washed his left side. The standard Islamic understanding, which I believe is correct, is that these references to the stone, sometimes called the Makam, are references to the Makam Ibrahim stone that is still on view in the Mecca for Muslims to this present day. On the photograph that you see on the screen at the moment, it is housed within this gold pillar. As you see, it's only a few yards from the Kaaba and from another mysterious stone, the black stone, which is set into this corner. When Muslims perform a circumambulation of the Kaaba, they generally start either from the Black Stone or from the Maqam Ibrahim as being the two conspicuous features marking out the start of a lap, as it were. These are the two best photographs that I've been able to find for the item on the internet. You see it's a rather curious item. It's a stepped rectangular block with two steps, two tiers. It has some decorative carving upon it. The two most striking features are, of course, these two large indentations, which are evocative of two giant footprints. And it's not, what you see is not all stone. There seems to be a silver crown over it. You see this in more detail in the lower picture. And it's not obvious from looking at it whether this adds any depth to the indentation, whether basically what is inside the silver is more of the stone, or whether it is in fact hollow and the silver crown has actually added depth to the indentation. We simply can't tell from this angle, but the silver surround has got Arabic writing and patterns. Clearly, it's not a natural boulder. It's not something that either Ishmael's second wife or Abraham found lying around and just happened to stand on, or chose to stand on as an ad hoc device. Rather, it's a fashioned and decorated artifact. The indentations that I call footprints give a superficial basis for presenting this block as a standing place. So when the Quran refers to the Maqam, or the Maqam of Ibrahim, this looks somewhat like something somebody has stood on. It has that impression, perhaps, of being a pedestal. However, it doesn't really fit either of the stories, either of the two explanations, the one in the Musannaf or the one recorded by Al-Tabari. It doesn't really fit the explanations that are given for this rock. For one thing, the Maqam Ibrahim stone looks as though it would be very heavy for one person to move. In particular, if one imagines Ishmael's second wife finding a visitor on a camel, is it really plausible that she would drag this heavy stone item any distance for the person to rest his foot on? Not least, wouldn't it be easier for him to ride his camel over to the stone if that's the stone was what you wanted to use? The Maqam Ibrahim stone is too low. It doesn't look, it looks about a foot or less than a foot in height. It looks too low for standing upon it to serve any practical purpose. If you're mounted, you'd have to be mounted on something like a Shetland pony before this would have any support for you. If you're trying to build a Kaaba and you can't reach high enough, this isn't going to add very much to your height. It doesn't really look like it's fit for the purpose that is being given to it or allocated to it by the tradition. The indentations clearly are not actual footprints. It can't be the case that an individual stood on it and sank down to create these shapes. There's no toes, there is no general shape of a foot. Is it suggested that Abraham was wearing very large and shapeless shoes? It doesn't really fit any of the stories that are being given. It's not the case that Abraham rested his foot and left these shapes upon it. If the rock was soft, if for example this was clay of some sort, at the time when Abraham stood on it, in order that his standing on it would create these indentations, it raises the question, why on earth did he stand upon it? It doesn't seem to serve any purpose if his aim was to rest his foot or to reach up. If the footprints were miraculously made in a hard rock, then sinking into the rock would have frustrated Abraham's purpose for standing on it, which was either to rest his feet or to extend his reach. For either purpose, it would be counterproductive for God to then make Abraham's foot sink into a rock miraculously. This would actually frustrate what Abraham was trying to do. So to reflect upon the traditional Islamic narrative, the earliest Islamic accounts asserting that Abraham, Hagar and Ishmael were in the Hijaz all refer to Abraham standing upon a stone, either to rest his feet or to build the Kaaba. Therefore, it seems reasonable to infer that the Maqam Ibrahim stone that is currently in the Kaaba was probably in existence and treated as a religiously important artifact before these stories were first recorded. This must have been before 827. However, neither account of Abraham standing upon a stone serves any narrative purpose whatsoever. The fact that he rested his foot upon a stone while he was sat upon his camel, or the fact that he stood upon it whilst building the Kaaba, has absolutely no significance to the story at all, other than to incorporate the Maqam Ibrahim stone into the Quranic story. Moreover, these stories failed to really explain the physical attributes of the stone object in question. So my conclusion is that a revered stone, which may well have existed independently of the tradition of Abraham, Hagar and Ishmael visiting the Hijaz, since it doesn't really fit the story or any version of the story, was integrated into the Islamic narrative in part to give a literal explanation for the Quran's reference to the standing place of Abraham, a very literal reference, namely as a stone block that Abraham actually stood on. This of course disregards the book of Genesis, which uses the word Maqam 4 times in connection with Abraham and the binding of Isaac. It is worth noting a few points of contact with the mysterious black stone as well. Both are cultic stones, that is to say, they are objects made out of stone which people treat as precious relics and venerate, which contrasts with Islam's claimed tradition of not venerating objects for fear of shirk. If one asks, where did Muhammad live? Did no one ever preserve his house or any of his wives' houses or any personal effect, any item of clothing? The explanation that is generally given is that the early Muslims didn't want to treat these items as special for fear of encouraging idolatry. But that's not the case with these 2 stones. Both the black stone and the Maqam Ibrahim stone are clearly regarded as very precious religious icons. Secondly, the black stone and the Maqam Ibrahim stone may well predate and have been integrated into the Islamic narrative, despite having no clear connection to the Quran. The black stone is not mentioned in the Quran, and I would say that no stone with footprints is mentioned in the Quran either. The Maqam has a completely different explanation. And both, curiously and coincidentally, are in very close physical proximity to one another within the Meccan shrine. For all the reasons set out in this video, my conclusion is that the Quran's references to the station of Abraham and to the place assigned for Abraham all refer to Mount Moriah, the site where Abraham was tested by being required to sacrifice his son Isaac, which was also the site of the Jerusalem Temple on Temple Mount. Please join me again next week when I shall be moving on with this inquiry and having a look at the pilgrimage to the house of God. As always, please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing, and following me on Islam Research GP on Twitter. And as with previous videos, all slides will be posted on my Twitter account in case you wish to refresh your memory without having to watch the whole thing again. Thank you.